Turn your Bibles to James chapter 1, and we're going to read verses 5 through 8. And I've entitled our lesson, Wise, it's a question, wise or double-minded? So we're going to look at what James has to say about that. So James chapter 1, and I'll read verses 5 through 8, and that's what we'll focus on this morning. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. So we're going to be looking at this difference between wisdom and being double-minded. Notice that he starts verse 5 off, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. And what he's going to do, he's going to use this idea of asking God, which is a reference to prayer, kind of for a springboard for the rest of the little paragraph. But let's talk about wisdom for a moment, because the book of James is considered by many as the New Testament literature counterpart for wisdom literature. And I think we said this before when we first started studying James. When we look at the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, what do we think of? Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, those kind of works. And so the New Testament really only has James that has some of the features of wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And there's so much emphasis on wisdom, both in the Old Testament and in living out the Christian life. I wanted to look at a couple of features real quick. If you have your Old Testament with you, turn to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 1, verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction. These Proverbs are for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right, just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple. It's interesting, let me pause here. In the wisdom literature, often the idea of simple doesn't mean simple-minded. The idea of simple is living the kind of life that honors God, and you don't have a heart of duplicity or hypocrisy or anything like that. The motives of your heart are just pure and simple. And also, I think, an openness to being instructed by wisdom itself. So knowledge and discretion to the young, let the wise listen and add to their learning, let the discerning get guidance, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. And then look at verse 7, which is really critical, actually for the whole Bible, but I love that it's here in Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. That's a very important comment, because wisdom is designed to instruct. Here's something else that's really fascinating. When you study in Scripture, some ideas are personified. And what I mean by that is that you can take an idea and make it sound like it's a person talking. And this is what happens in Proverbs chapter 8. All of a sudden, wisdom is treated like a person that's talking, which is kind of a fascinating grammatical feature. Let's see. Does not wisdom call out? And she cries aloud. That's verse 3. And I wanted to point out, let's see. Yeah, verse 4 is where the quotation begins. Wisdom is like a person crying out. To you, O people, I call out. I raise my voice to all mankind. You who are simple, gain prudence. You who are foolish, set your hearts on it. Listen, for I have trustworthy things to say. I open my lips to speak what is right. So, and then the rest of that chapter and other places in Proverbs, you have wisdom speaking and providing instruction and guidance, and people who are prudent and want to live the kind of life that honors God listens to wisdom. So it's really fascinating the way the book of Proverbs is laid out, how it functions. Yes.
I have always had a problem, but the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Um,
I never understood the fear of the Lord.
well, let's contrast it this way. I think what he's getting at, there's a couple things at once, but one is, if I ask this question, what is the source of knowledge? See, there's some knowledge that is what we would call empirical, sort of scientific, we would say human-centered. We're discovering it through the senses. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So that it's a statement that the kind of knowledge is going to feed your soul and give you instruction for destiny and life. It comes from a reverence and an awe and a fear of who God is. So what I almost hear the writer here in Proverbs saying is, if you really want the kind of knowledge that's going to make a difference in your life, you know where it came from and you know who God is, where it came from. So the fear of the Lord has to do with a reverence and a sort of a posture of attitude that recognizes there's no place for human pride in knowledge. See, think about, Paul even says this in Corinthians, think about how so much human pride is attached to knowledge. I mean, you see it in so many different ways. I mean, we could just start listing all the ways. A spiritual perspective on knowledge recognizes that all knowledge goes back to God. And when I fear the Lord for who he is, then I'm going to take that knowledge seriously, which means, in fact, I was reading one Christian writer years ago who said this, don't waste your time on knowledge that doesn't do any good for your soul. Well, there's a lot of knowledge that we have to know, just to make it through the day that may not necessarily deal with our soul. But overall, what's important to us is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That you start with a spiritual, I'm going to throw out are you ready for what's the word? Are you ready for a technical term? What we're actually talking about is the spiritual foundation for an epistemology. That is, how do I know truth? Where does truth come from? Well, for the writer of the book of Hebrews, or Proverbs, it begins with the fear of the Lord, so that there's no place for human pride in the knowledge that I have. In fact, one of the things that historically Christianity has always said, that sometimes we don't get, is that all knowledge really is a gift from God. Our ability to know, our ability to process things, to think about things, and to understand the world, even that process is a gift from God. It's all a gift from God. So I don't know if that helps, but it's such a succinct, powerful phrase. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So thanks for the question. But this is kind of the world of wisdom. James is going to add to this a Christian perspective that you really don't find emphasized in the Old Testament. And that is, if you lack wisdom that you feel like you need for the moment, what are you supposed to do? Well, one choice would be just give up. Well, I don't know, so forget. He says if you lack the wisdom you need, you ask of God. Oh, so there's actually two kinds of wisdom. There's the wisdom you gain from life experiences, but then there's the wisdom that's gifted to you by God when you ask in prayer. He doesn't give us, you know, guidance on when we should ask that. I suspect there are times in our life when we've come to that point and we realize, okay, this is one of those times when I don't have the wisdom and I need to ask God for it. And you probably have been there. So, but wisdom can be granted by God as a gift. Um, Another thing he's going to mention that I really like that often can be overlooked is he's going to use this occasion right now of making a real quick comment. And you need to catch these, not only in the book of James, but all through scripture. Uh, there'll be like little quick side comments about the nature of God. And this is an interesting one. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. And notice the comment about who God is, who gives generously to all without finding fault. Now, why is that an important statement about who God is? Nancy?
He gives regardless of a person's past sins or infractions. In other words, if you've sinned and messed up your life and you come to him and ask for wisdom and help
Okay.
and forgive, he's not going to reproach you and say, no,
Yeah,
no. It's regardless of how messed up.
that's a perspective. I like this idea because it's kind of, think about this, it's kind of like if you ever remember growing up asking your parents for something, they scolded you for asking. You know better than to ask for that. You may have heard that growing up. You know better than to ask. Well, when we're in a situation that we're asking for wisdom, God's going to grant that when we need it because he's a God who gives generously. He's not going to arbitrarily say, no, 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 no. Oh, our God is a giving God. This is a neat little comment. And I think it's designed, I suspect it's designed to help give us motivation to want to approach God when we need to ask him for anything. Now, he may say no, because that would be the best answer at the moment. But this insight about who God is a generous God. Think about the generosity of God. Let's pause and think about this for a moment. When I think of God as a generous God, what areas of life does that touch? When I say God is a generous God, what comes to your mind?
Everything.
Okay, specifically, what? Name me one.
He gives sunlight every day.
Okay,
He
so
gives.
think about just the physical world in which he continues to give. In fact, there's the idea he makes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. Okay, so that's one. What else does God
Gives
generously
our
give?
food, our clothing.
What's in?
Oxygen.
Oh, yeah. He generously gives us our oxygen and we can breathe. Uh, think about how generous he is with forgiveness and mercy, how generous he is with grace. Well, and that's what the New Testament writers affirm. Every good gift comes from God. God is a generous giver. And that's one of the reasons why there's so much, I think, in the New Testament about Thanksgiving. I don't know if you've ever noticed and marked down all of the verses that had to do with Thanksgiving. They're all over the place. And the reason for that, that's our response to this generous God. And so just maybe we need to be reminded occasionally how generous our God is. Think of the song in our hymn book, count your many blessings, see what God hath done. Well, if you start counting them, it's almost like you can't end. You start listing them and they're everywhere. Yeah. Now, God being a generous God means that we understand how he accepts us in our humanity. Aren't you thankful that this generous God doesn't base his generosity on our perfection. Where God could come along and say, okay, until you get your life right, I'm not giving you anything. Until you get your house in order, forget it. Well, God's not like that. I'm thankful. Think of the generous gift of God giving his son on the cross for our salvation. Wow, how generous.
And it all comes back to God's love.
Mm-hmm.
For humanity.
Yes, it's a
And his
generosity
creation.
born out of love. Mm-hmm. It is. Exactly. So it's incredible. Do we struggle with having favorites? And this is cool. Apparently, it was such a huge issue when James writes his letter. Guess what he's going to do in chapter 2? He's going to address the problem of favorites and partiality in their congregation. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Now, as he's continuing here, then we've been talking about the very nature of God. He gives generously without finding fault or reproaching or scolding us, and it will be given to you. Verse 6, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. Let's talk about this doubt for a moment. It is in contrast to faith. We pray in faith as opposed to in doubt. Now, does that mean that doubt will never enter into a person's life? Well, all of us have probably gone through times of doubt. So what kind of doubt is he talking about here? Can we be a little bit more specific as it applies to prayer life? What's he trying to tell us?
It's like, why even pray if you don't think God could do this?
Mm-hmm. You just never know how God's going to answer prayer. That's sort of embracing the mystery of the faith that we have with God. But it is critical. In fact, Jesus told his disciples, if you say to this mountain over here, be removed into the sea, it'll be done. And you're like, whoa.
If you have faith.
If you have faith. We'll see this in today's lesson too, in Matthew. There are places where it seems like Jesus will talk in hyperbole to make a strong point. But we don't have any record where any of the disciples actually asked Jesus or God to take a mountain and move it into the sea. But what Jesus, I think, is talking about with that hyperbole is you don't understand how powerful prayer is. And that's kind of what's going on here. We sometimes we have doubts, but if we go to prayer to God and we say something like, I know this isn't going to do any good, but I'm going to pray anyway. Well, why waste the time and effort? Or how many times have you prayed for something wondering if it'll happen, only to be surprised it actually did, that God did answer your prayer, and you're like, wow, this is incredible.
But you have to pray by what we do, not by.
Yeah,
Because he knows what's best for you. Sometimes we do ask for things that are.
Mhm. Here's the interesting thing about prayer. All of us at this point in our life have been exposed to many, many of the Bible passages on prayer, and we've practiced it in our life. Think about right now how you as a child of God think about prayer in your life, how you participate in it, what it means to you, just the opportunity to address God in prayer is a gift and a blessing of being one of his children. The idea of doubting here is one in which you just don't know and you're unsure, like, I just don't think it'll do any good. Well, I can almost hear James saying, well, if you don't think it's going to do any good, why even pray? Now he's going to use an illustration to talk about a person who doubts and wavers like this, what is his illustration? What little picture does he give to demonstrate that? A wave.
Yeah, tossed by the way.
Yeah, the wave. But see, look at how it's worded. It's interesting. And you could probably think about, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea. Now, I suppose if you're in a boat, it would have the same effect, but you're like a wave of the sea. That wave is driven and tossed about by the wind. If you've ever been on a body of water when it's white capping, that can be a little scary, especially if you're in a small boat. But a person who comes to a situation where they really need to believe in prayer if they don't. And James is saying, you're going to be like that wave of the sea, just tossed and driven about like the wind, wherever. Wow. And it's a strong image. And here's what he doesn't say, and I've often wondered. I wonder what was going on in the congregation here that this becomes a real issue. That he could look out among the members of that church and see or even know about situations where people maybe have said, prayer's not going to be worth it, why even try? It'd be interesting to know what that situation was, because we're only getting this end of the conversation. And yet, he's going to continue talking about this. And we've got enough time, I think, to talk about this. He's going to follow up with two observations. The first is that a person who is like this is double-minded. Now, we'll look at the other passage here in a moment. What does double-minded mean? You know, I was doing some reading last night. There is some interesting writing trying to connect the idea of double-minded and hypocrisy. There is some overlap there. I think you're right, Barbara. The idea of double-minded, it's hard to translate into English. It's a word which means two souls. In other words, your two selves, which can go to hypocrisy. But on the one hand, you know you need to engage in prayer. On the other hand, you don't believe in the power of prayer. And this idea of being double-minded is kind of like we would say today, sitting on the fence. It's hard to accomplish anything. Think about even in your prayer life. If you're sitting on the fence with God.
We don't really believe in either one.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't believe in the power of it. You're not sure God can answer it. So you're just kind of sitting on the fence. Look in chapter 4 and verse 8 of James, because this is the other place where he talks about being double-minded. Here's the other thing that's quite extraordinary, and I'll mention this in just a moment. But the letter of James in the New Testament, he's the only writer that uses this word double-minded. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. What does it mean here?
To live two lives at once. You're in the world, you're thinking like the world, then you dabble in God of life. Then you're back to the world thinking like the
You know, and I think the way you've worded it, Nancy, look up back in chapter 4, verse 4, because I think you're exactly right. He says, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? And there's been a lot of discussion where he's talking about literal adultery or not. See, the word adultery at its core points to lack of faithfulness in a covenant. And in all the Bible, there's two covenants that people can be unfaithful to. It's God and it's your spouse. Probably here, the adultery is in their covenant relationship with God. And a lot of commentators will say that. And that's why he said, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? And then, so when you get down to chapter 4, verse 8, he wants them to purify your hearts, you double-minded. So A person that's double-minded doesn't have a pure heart. It's one that is filled with deception and doubt, being friend with the world, and yet you're claiming to be a friend of God. See, he kind of goes with my lesson this morning. James, along with Jesus, has so much to say about the motive of our heart. What condition is my spiritual heart in? What do I think about? What's my motive? What are my attitudes? That's what scripture is all about. Now, when I was growing up, I didn't hear a whole lot of that, unfortunately. I heard a lot of what I was supposed to do and not do. And, there are places for that. But if I totally miss attitude, motive, my thoughts, condition of my heart, am I not missing some of the most important stuff? So this is really critical here. Yeah. Oh, here's the other thing. James is the only New Testament writer that uses this word. When we get to the 2nd century early church fathers, all of a sudden, among 5 different writers, there's 1st and 2nd Clement, there's the Shepherd of Hermas. What's the other one? There's 2 other documents. In these early Christian documents that date in the 200s, all of a sudden this word is used 65 times. And when I first discovered that in my reading and everything, I was like, gotta be kidding. Why would this word double-minded only be used twice in the New Testament? Then all of a sudden, let's say 100, 150 years after the close of the New Testament, why all of a sudden, with the Christian writers in the early 200s, start using this word all over the place? What do you think might be going on that would make it necessary to use this word?
Falling away.
Falling away because of what?
Well, maybe lack of practice.
That and persecution, fear of being persecuted. There were a lot of reasons that people, because of lack of faithfulness, apparently it was a big problem in second century Christianity. It was a big problem and sometimes writers will use the word. Now the writer of the book of Hebrews uses this word. Don't shrink back. That's the word he uses. What's the word that we've used growing up? Like follow. So and so fell away from the church. That's our language. Yeah.
Backslide.
Or backslide. Yeah. In early Christianity, they used the word defect. They defected from the church. But I think this is why this word is used so much, is because there were so many people claiming to be Christians that when the heat in the kitchen got too hot, they got out of the kitchen. That's what was going on. And it's like, wow. And apparently, James was seeing this in his congregation, so much so that he has to mention it and draw attention to it.
Curtis, would it be kind of like a person that attends every Sunday morning church and then living for the devil the other 6 days?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's a double-minded
It'd
person.
be a good example. Yeah. Now here's the problem with this is from our perspective, we would not know if a person necessarily is guilty of being double.
No, we don't know.
That's between
We
the
don't know
person and
people's
God.
hearts. We're-
However, apparently James is seeing some stuff that is glaring enough that he can make that comment, that there are people that are friends with the world when they're claiming to be friends with God. He said, that's not going to work.
says, the integrity of the upright guides them,
hmm
but the crookedness of the treacherous destroys them.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's consequences. Some of them can be immediate. Okay.
Curtis,
Yes.
I think it's interesting that we know Solomon as a wisdom person, and David's advice to Solomon is really interesting in First Chronicles 28, verse 9.
Uh-huh.
If you look at that, he says, if thou seek him, he will be found of thee. But if thou forsake him, he will cast thee off forever.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's First Chronicles 28:9.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And that's during the context of when David's making plans for the temple. And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father and serve him wholeheartedly, devotion, and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every desire and every thought. Both the Old and New Testament, thank you, Beth, for that. That's really good. In both the Old and New Testament, another feature of the nature of God is he's always presented as the God who searches the hearts. Whew. Do you realize that what's in your heart you can't hide from God? Now we can hide from others, can't hide from God. Ooh. An all-seeing eyes watching you and knowing you and searching you. Now, we've got time for one more comment Nancy brought up. The unstable. Notice that he said, if you're this way, you're unstable in all your ways. This means lacking stability and inconsistency with your faith, because what was important in all the New Testament letters was two things: spiritual maturity and ongoing growth. And if you look at so much of all the letters, and James is the same way, they're concerned that the Christians grow and that they come to a place of spiritual maturity. You get the impression that so much of what's written is foundational and basic, and you come away thinking, shouldn't they know this stuff? It's so basic. But he's having to go back and say, look, this is where it starts. And if you don't get this right, nothing else is going to be right. Nancy?
And instability keeps the mind in this wavering constant.
Yeah.
Like I love the illustration of the waves, the constant waves coming at you.
Yeah.
You're up, you're down.
Yeah.
Sometimes you think, I can do this with the Lord's help.
Yeah.
Persecution comes. I can't do this. This is terrible. And you're miserable. You're walking the fence. You said that earlier.
Yeah.
But once you make a decision
Mm-hmm.
to suffer, I will go through the fire if he wants me to.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's how much I love him. Trust him.
Right.
Once you throw your heart over the bar, that's the illustration for sports jumping the high bar. The coach says, throw your heart over the bar,
Right.
and then you'll make the jump.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to throw your heart over the bar and settle it once and for all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're in for God
Yeah.
or not, because that's a miserable life, just walking.
It is. Decide to jump off the fence and get on the God's side. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I hope that this has been a good little study on, are we going to be wise or are we going to be double-minded? And if you don't have the wisdom that you feel like you need for the moment, guess what? You can pray for it and God will give it to you. So we'll pick up there next week. Thank you all for being here for Bible class.